Hello and welcome to the Hill and Valley YouTube channel. E-commerce photos may seem really simple at first, just put the product on a white backdrop and that's it. E-commerce photos often come with a lot of challenges, from lighting to retouching and product positioning. We recently photographed a few mountain bikes in our studios, and today I'm going to share with you some of the challenges we faced and how we overcame them. These are 3 tips for e-commerce photography. Tip number 1 is about background placement. Since our product was a very large mountain bike, we had a lot of challenges fitting that bike inside the frame as well as in front of the backdrop. We only had a 9-foot wide paper backdrop to shoot on, and so with the bike being so large, it was difficult to make sure that the front and back edges of the bike weren't hanging over the edge of the backdrop. If I placed the bike right in front of the backdrop, I would get a lot of unwanted light spill onto the product, which isn't ideal. With e-commerce photos, you want a really clear separation between the product and the background. So you typically want your product to be a few feet or as far away from the backdrop as you can so that the product is in sharp focus, but the background is out of focus and cleanly white. With product photography, we typically use a high f-stop to make sure that the entirety of the product is in focus, but if the product is right next to the background, some of the background would probably end up in focus as well, making it harder to retouch and get a clean separation. So I decided to pull the bike about 6 feet away from the backdrop. But once I pulled the bike away from the backdrop, the edges of the bike were not fitting within the edges of the background. So to fix this problem, I switched to a much longer focal length lens and moved myself as far back from the product as I could. This was helpful because longer focal length lenses have greater compression than wide lenses. So by using a long lens, I was able to bring the bike far enough away from the background so that I wasn't getting any light spill while also keeping it within the frame of the background. In short, for large products, you want to use a long lens, step back, and move the product away from the backdrop as much as you can while keeping it in frame. For most e-commerce photos, the goal is to show the product being well lit without seeing any shadows and having it on a perfectly white, clean background. While this can be achieved by using some complex lighting setups, I came across a simpler solution. Our product was a large bike, so we couldn't fit it inside of a light tent, and the textured tires would have been impossible to light from below if the bike was actually just sitting on the ground. So we suspended it in the air. We did this by using a C-stand with an extension arm and a super clamp, and then to lift the front end of the bike, we used some fishing line hanging from another extension arm. Although I had to retouch out the clamp, we placed it in a spot that was straight and uniform, so I knew it was going to be easy enough to retouch in Photoshop. Now that the bike was suspended, the tires were getting filled in from the bottom with light bouncing off the paper backdrop. This saved us tons of time in post-production because we didn't have to retouch out the contact shadows of the tires or try and artificially light them in post. Tip number 2 would be to orient your product so that there are no shadows on your product or your background. Tip number 3 would be, don't just say that you can fix it in post. Going into this project, I knew that there was going to be a certain amount of retouching required. However, we did as much as we could to reduce that amount of post-production work. These bikes were one-of-a-kind prototypes, and the client had to take them to a trade show before we shot them, where they got muddy and scuffed. Ideally, for e-commerce photography, you want your products to be brand new and perfectly clean, but that's just not always the case. We ended up spending a few hours cleaning the bikes by hand before we shot them, and I'm really glad we did. Although it wasn't the type of work we wanted to be doing, it saved us countless hours retouching every single muddy spot off of the bike. So in short, this tip is, make sure your product is as clean and perfect as it can be before you take the photo. You'll thank yourself later when you're editing. To recap, tip number 1 is for large products to put space between yourself, the product, and the background and use a long lens. Tip number 2 is to orient the product in a way that you're reducing the amount of shadows you have on the product or the background. And tip number 3 is to clean your product and make sure it is as perfect as can be before you take the photo. Save yourself time in post-production. These have been my 3 tips that I learned while recently shooting a bike in our studio. I hope they've been helpful and can give you some guidance on your next photography project. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.